it's really a thrill to see a crowd this size and to have my friends from the Jewish community and the Christian community, and all of us are getting together. I often hear myself saying that one of the greatest blessings of my long life is to have seen before World War II. I was just a little baby, and my first conscious memory was the night the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And fortunately, I spent those coming years with my Presbyterian grandmother, whose favorite Bible verse was the one in Jeremiah 31 that says, "As long as the sun and the moon and the stars endure, God has a covenant with the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And we would sit in front of the old Silvertone radio every night after dinner and listen to what she called the war news, and then she would pray for my cousins who were in the military, and then she'd read to me from the Bible, and we often read that passage from Jeremiah. And she would say to me, "Joanne, this is a terrible war, but Hitler will be defeated, and the Jews will be back in their ancient land, and we must pray for that." And she really, truly believed that. After she died in May of 1947, well, I always say I think she saw the birth of Israel from a better seat. But I spent that next year, as probably in 6th grade, reading through her Bible and looking at all the things she'd underlined. And on the back table, I have a study manual I wrote some years ago for Israel tourists that has 2 pages of Bible verses that I found underlined in my grandmother's Bible that build the case for God's eternal covenant, the irrevocable one that we have come to talk about tonight. So 2 of my favorite people are here. Those of you who've been on tour with me will laugh because I'm always introducing people as my favorite people, but they really are. I can't help it. God sent me so many good friends. But Trisha Miller and Dexter Van Zile are both friends of mine from back a ways. Dexter and I have been in a number of battles together with the Presbyterian adventure, and we could tell you lots of stories. And there's a good story about Trisha when she came here to speak a few years ago and had a chapter of camera that was involved down at Augsburg College. And would you believe it, at Augsburg there was a branch of students supporting Israel, SSI, which is a really great group, and the leader of that group at Augsburg is here tonight, Julian Kritz. He's going to speak a little bit tomorrow night, but Julian, why don't you stand up? Just so. Miller in to speak at Augsburg. And now Augsburg, for those of you who may not live in the area, is a very Lutheran school. And the bishop of the Lutheran church, a guy named Hansen, came in that night looking kind of grumpy and sat in the far end of the room, and at question and answer time was really going to tear Trisha apart. And Julian stood up politely, respectfully, and asked the bishop to yield the floor since we hadn't come together to hear him speak. So, very graciously, very mature, very sophisticated, but he took control. We need to learn how to do that. Anyway, so I would like to have Trisha, and Trisha's going to speak first, and then Dexter will speak, and both of them are serious researchers who dig into the whole history of this. Trisha has been studying what's going on with the Protestant youth groups, where we are seeing more than a drift, almost a flood away from any kind of a strong biblical position and any kind of interest in Israel. So Trisha, are you here?
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you all for being here. It's really good to be here. Thank you, Brad and Jerry, for really, really wonderful presentations. It's a joy to work with both of you and with Dexter. And Dexter will be talking after me. It's just really great to be here, and I really appreciate you all being here. We have, this is a joint talk with Dexter and me, and we've titled this session Christian Responsibility in Such a Time as This. The expression "in such a time as this" comes from Esther 4:14. It's become a common expression now with people who are concerned and are aware of the dangerous times in which we live. It's especially meaningful to me. I did my doctoral work on the book of Esther. The reason I even started graduate studies and got into, my degree is in Hebrew Bible, so I had to write about something that was in the Hebrew Bible. The reason I even got into that was because of something that Jerry mentioned. What I noticed in the church was so many churches just forgetting 3/4 of our Bible. 3/4 of the Bible that we claim that Christians have appropriated. Christians are not responsible for it. It was all Jewish people who wrote it, preserved it, and passed it on. But that was why I even started my studies, because I became aware of Christian anti-Semitism. I became aware of the lack of knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures and wanted to do something about it. So that's why I'm here. So the fact that this phrase from Esther 4:14 has become so common doesn't diminish the importance of the imperative to take action that Mordecai gave Esther, and that was in the context of an impending genocide of the Jewish people. So by studying and writing on the book of Esther, and my book in the back is an adaptation and bringing it up to current events. It's an adaptation of my dissertation on Esther, but it brings in current events and makes it applicable to Israel. So in this spirit of Mordecai admonishing, and really it's an imperative that's used in Esther, that, you know, what he said to Esther, that she needed to do something. I want to talk about the Christian responsibility to know the truth and to stand for truth, especially in these dangerous times for Jews and Christians alike. And I'm very, very thankful. I know that we have Jewish people in the audience also, and I'm very thankful that you're here. My comments are addressed primarily to Christians. I'm here to admonish Christians to know the truth and take a stand for truth. There's going to be a lot of focus throughout this conference. You've already heard it some. There's going to be more on the theological aspects of the current issues, both in relation to why Christians support Israel and in relation to the erroneous theology that's used to support the Christian anti-Israel agenda. So I'm not going to talk as much about theology. I want to focus on a particular historical aspect. It's related to the theological aspects. And I want to give you information that's going to help you stand for the truth in the face of propaganda that's been created for the purpose of delegitimizing the existence of the Jewish state. Because a lot of what is said about the Jewish state is so similar and at times identical to what has been said about Jews throughout the centuries, I want to talk about the connection between historic Christian anti-Judaism and current Christian anti-Zionism, and explain how historic anti-Judaism does in fact inform the anti-Zionism of today. I hope this discussion will show how opposition to the existence of a Jewish state, opposition that's based on a false theological and historical narrative, is nothing more than a new form of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. I also hope that the explanation of the connection between historic and current forms of this disease, which is what it is, I hope this connection will equip you to stand for truth in relation to Israel's right to exist in such a time as this. I want to begin with a brief explanation of the terms I'm using. Theoretically, anti-Judaism refers to the opposition to and persecution of Jews based on their religion. Or you could say it as the denial of Jews to exist in terms of their own self-understanding. Anti-Semitism is theoretically defined as opposition to Jews based on their ethnicity. However, in spite of the fact that anti-Judaism is defined in religious terms and anti-Semitism in terms of race, there is essentially no difference between them because an underlying contempt for Jews is the foundation for both. Anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are about as old as the Jewish people themselves. We can go back to the story of Exodus even and the attempt to wipe out the Jewish race by killing all the male babies. But for sure, we can also go back to the persecution of the Jews as a people group during the Greco-Roman time period. And that persecution was directly related to Greek and Roman opposition to essential identifying features of Judaism, which are God, Torah, and the land. The land. As Jerry said, Eretz, it always means the land of Israel. The same holds true to this day. Anti-Semitism has been justified ever since antiquity as an appropriate response to Jewish characteristics that are deemed undesirable. And these characteristics are in turn attributed to the Jewish religion. Again, the same holds true today. If you have any doubt about the relationship between anti-Semitism and opposition to Judaism, just think about the dichotomy between what the term anti-Semitism technically means and how we use it. Technically, someone who is an anti-Semite would be anti-anyone of Semitic origin. That would include Arabs. But we all know that's not how it actually is used. Someone who is anti-Semitic is specifically anti-Jewish. In fact, the term anti-Semite or anti-Semitic was coined in 1879 by a German academic named Wilhelm Marr to refer to anti-Jewish campaigns that were happening at that time in Europe. Today, the contempt for Jews that has historically been identified as anti-Judaism and or anti-Semitism manifests as anti-Zionism or opposition to Zionism, which is simply a movement in support of a Jewish state in the ancient homeland of the Jews, the land of Israel. Because anti-Zionism opposes the existence of a Jewish state, it can also be defined as a denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, a central part of which is the desire to re-establish a state in their ancient homeland. Just as anti-Semitism is justified as an appropriate response to undesirable characteristics of the Jewish religion, anti-Zionism is justified as the proper response to one of the identifying features of Judaism, which is the historic centrality of the land of Israel. Jewish people have always longed to return to the land. In their prayers, multiple times a day, they pray for Jerusalem. They pray facing Jerusalem. I'm sure a lot of you know all of those facts. It's central. So this is how anti-Zionism is synonymous with historic anti-Judaism. The right of Jews to exist in terms of their own self-understanding, and in this case, the right to have a state, it's denied them. Anti-Zionism is also synonymous with historic anti-Semitism, in that by opposing the existence of a Jewish state, Jews are opposed on the basis of ethnicity. And in today's world, in such a time as this opposition manifests through the demonization and the delegitimization of Jewish Israelis as a people group. It's serious enough that much of the Western world, not to mention most of the Arab world, erroneously believes that the existence of this little tiny democratic Jewish state is the source of all the chaos in the Middle East. However, it's even more alarming now that some parts of Christendom believe this and support movements that seek to terminate Israel's existence one way or another, either violently or through BDS. I'm going to be talking tomorrow about the future of evangelical support for Israel, and this historical support for a Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland can no longer be taken for granted due to an intense and increasingly successful anti-Israel campaign that's spearheaded by Palestinian Christians. This Christian version of anti-Zionism employs a false narrative that is informed by historic Christian anti-Judaism. Let me give you a couple examples. Jerry he mentioned in the first centuries of the Christian era, the church began to lose its Jewish identity very quickly. The church started to identify itself as the true Israel and Christianity as the scriptural fulfillment of Judaism. This was the beginning of the development of replacement theology, which identifies Christians as the heirs of Jewish history and the Hebrew Bible. I'm not going to go into any detail about this because Brad's going to be talking more about replacement theology in the morning. But I want to point out that because this theology purports that Christians and the church have replaced Jews and Israel in the purposes of God, it concludes that there's no purpose in the existence of Jews or a Jewish state. They shouldn't even be here anymore. They're just a problem. So this is a classic example of the denial of the right of Jews to exist in terms of their own understanding. This is classic historic anti-Judaism. Inherent in the denial of Jews to exist in terms of their self-understanding is opposition to Jews on the basis of their ethnicity. And as you remember, this was the definition of anti-Semitism. Current opposition to the existence of the state of Israel because of its identity as Jewish state demonstrates that current anti-Zionism is just a new manifestation of historic anti-Semitism. Current Palestinian theology reflects centuries of this anti-Jewish teaching through a customized version of replacement theology, as demonstrated through a quote from Mitri Raheb, who's the pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem. When he was speaking at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, which you'll hear more about both from Dexter and me, at least me, I think Dexter's been mentioned too. Speaking at that conference in 2010, he said, this is a quote, "Israel represents Rome of the Bible, not the people of the land." And this is not just because I'm a Palestinian. I'm sure if we were to do a DNA test between David, who was a Bethlehemite, and Jesus, born in Bethlehem, and Mitri, born just across the street from where Jesus was born, I'm sure the DNA will show there is a trace. While if you put King David, Jesus, and Netanyahu, you'll get nothing, because Netanyahu comes from an East European tribe who converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages. End of quote. That is blatantly false. There's been many studies done on that. I don't have time to go into that. But that is the lie that's told as part of this propaganda, that the current people there who claim to be Jews are not really, don't have any relation to ancient Jews, which is false. That's all I can say about that now. This statement provides a vivid example, though, of how Palestinian Christians deny Jewish identity and historic connection to the land through the claim that they're the indigenous people of the land. So the Palestinians now claim they're the indigenous people, which leads into all kinds of things, which I'm going to get into more tomorrow, including a Palestinian Jesus. So the rejection of Jewish identification with the land is not only the natural outcome of these centuries of anti-Jewish teachings, but it's a good example of how current anti-Zionism is the new manifestation of historic anti-Judaism. Again, Jerry gave us a great overview of how the early church fathers began teaching and writing. And they were invalidating the identity of the Jews, and they were negating their claim to the Bible as well. The identity of the very people who were responsible for the recording and preservation of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings found in the Hebrew Bible was deemed to be invalid and was negated by the church. The teachings of the early church fathers were a direct statement in opposition to one of the essential identifying features of Judaism, which is the connection of the Jewish people to the Torah God gave them at Mount Sinai. Naim Atik, who's the father of Palestinian liberation theology, identifies Palestinians as poor, disenfranchised victims of powerful Israeli oppressors. Because of this, he objects to Christians who read the Bible literally in relation to Israel. He says, this is a quote, "There are certain passages in the Old Testament whose theological presuppositions and at times assertions need not be affirmed by the church. These passages need not impose particular doctrinal views or obligation on the contemporary Christian." End of quote. In other words, Atik is saying that the passages in the Hebrew Bible that speak about the Jewish connection to the land and the future for Jews in that land don't need to be taken seriously or believed. So he's choosing which passages of Scripture to affirm or not to affirm based on what they say in relation to the historically flawed Palestinian claim to the land. This is a graphic example of opposition to Jews on the basis of their ethnicity and their scripture. And it's yet another example of how current anti-Zionists oppose essential identifying features of Judaism, such as the Jewish connection to the land and the Jewish claim to their Bible. These examples that demonstrate this I've only just scratched the surface. There's many more, but I'm going to stop now for the sake of time. So in closing, I said at the beginning, as I'm really addressing my comments to the Christians here, I want to admonish all of us to stand against Christian anti-Zionism. It really is nothing more than anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes of history. And I encourage you all to stand for the truth in the face of this propaganda that's been created for the purpose of delegitimizing the Jewish state. Take action in such a time as this. Support the right of Jews to exist in terms of their own self-understanding. Stand against the widespread opposition to essential identifying features of Judaism, one of which is their historic connection to the land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trisha. That's a very important beginning for a tough subject, but it's what we're about this weekend. We want to understand this, not so we can bash the church fathers. Everybody has made mistakes. There is no perfect person. But when we have discovered these things, then we're responsible to do something about it. So I'd like to call on Dexter. Dexter Van Zile is one of, along with Trisha, they are the chief researchers at CAMRA. Curious, how many of you had ever heard before about CAMRA before you came here? Okay, I would say less than half. CAMRA is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. It's an acronym. And it's mainly a Jewish organization that has two main researchers who are Christians. That could not have happened some years ago either. We have made some progress. We are working together at a new level. But Dexter I sometimes refer to as a junkyard dog. But I mean that lovingly. He's my favorite junkyard dog. He's a tough guy. He's a serious reporter. He digs in, he gets his teeth into a story, and he shakes it for all it's worth. And he has revealed, he's not going to talk about this tonight, but some of his major research has been done on the Christian Palestinians who are rewriting the Bible and spreading this around the church. The Christ at the Checkpoints, we'll hear more about that. It's a every other year conference where this Zile group, which is involved with liberation theology in Palestine, has a conference that seems very sweet and loving, and they always tell you they love everybody. But Dexter has gone to many of these, taken notes, sat in on what's actually being said. And he has done a great service at making that information available to the Christian church at large. You have to be a bit of a junkyard dog to hang on to that stuff. And Dexter is now going to talk to us about another problem that's being neglected in the world. Dexter, God bless you.
One of the biggest difficulties, or one of the great tragedies that we've seen in the latter half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century is that anti-Zionist activism has sucked all of the oxygen out of the room when it comes time for Christians, particularly in the West, to deal with issues related to the Middle East. One of the things that we have seen is, in the past few years, is that there's been a terrible crisis and essentially an ethnic cleansing or a genocide against Christians in Iraq and Syria. And I don't want to get too much into the numbers, but basically we can see the catastrophe that's unfolding before our eyes. But one of the difficulties that we have in getting people and convincing people to respond to this catastrophe is that they're so focused on Israel and its alleged mistreatment of the Palestinians. And what happens is that people pay so much attention to the Arab-Israeli conflict that they ignore what is happening to Christians in Iraq, Syria, in Lebanon and also in Egypt. And one of the things that we've discovered is that the Palestinian Christians, in an effort to basically place all the blame for the conflict on Israel, basically interrogate Jews, Zionism, and Judaism with an intense ferocity, and then will basically say, look, relationships between Christians and Muslims has been pretty good in the Middle East. It really didn't get bad until after Israel was created in 1948. And so what happens is that causes people here in the West to ignore large parts of world history that it basically contradicts and disconfirms that reality. And one of the things that I want to say is that I'm kind of overwhelmed by the graciousness of the invitation that I've been given here. Here I am, a Roman Catholic from Boston, speaking at a Presbyterian church in Minnesota. Folks, you got to make your coffee better. Decaf is just no good. All right. You know, I drink like regular coffee right up until midnight, like 12:02. I'm dead asleep. Okay. And you just drink more of it, you'll be fine. But here I am, a former mainline Protestant who converted to Catholicism, who works for CAMRA, an organization that belongs to the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, speaking to an audience comprised mostly of evangelical Protestants about the welfare of Eastern churches, who are mostly Orthodox Christians in Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East. Okay, it's enough to make your head spin. And it's not the first time that I've done that. CAMRA has hosted 2 conferences about Christians in the Middle East, and the vast majority of the people who showed up were evangelicals, like the people here in this room. The first was in Chicago in 2011, and the second was in 2012 in Boston. And and the thing is I spoke to somebody from Open Doors, which is an organization that supports the persecuted church throughout the world. And one of the things they said is, why are you having it in Boston? And there was some logistical problems. We were going to have it in Chicago, but things kind of fell apart. And they said, well, you really, that's not a really good place for evangelicals because there's just not that many up in Boston. And we still got 150 people in the room. I think it was all 150 people in the evangelical community throughout New England. I mean, they all knew each other. But the thing is that evangelicals have been the most ardent defenders of the persecuted church in the Middle East, just as they were the strongest and the most vocal supporters for Christians suffering under communism during the Cold War. This is nothing new for you. Richard Wurmbrand, who Joanne Magnuson knows, or has heard speak, I think. He was an evangelical Protestant from Romania, and one of the things that he did was he worked with he basically uplifted all of the Christians who were suffering. He didn't look at the doctrinal or the sectarian differences between Christians. And the thing is that evangelical Protestants here in the U.S., they support groups like Open Doors, Samaritan's Purse, Voice of the Martyrs, and Christian Solidarity International. And why are the evangelicals so interested in the status of Orthodox Christians, largely Orthodox and some Catholic Christians in the Middle East? Because despite all of these evangelical differences, the theological differences, for the same reason that you're here. They understand that these people are dying for the name of Christ. Okay? And we have an obligation to stand with them. So what are our responsibilities? One, I think we should affirm the legitimacy and defend the reputation of the one state in the Middle East where the indigenous population of Christians is growing, and that's the Jewish state of Israel. And to allow people, Christians especially, to defame Israel not only puts Jews at risk, but puts Christians at risk as well, and this is simply intolerable. And it puts Christians at risk for a number of reasons. Second, we need to start learning about how the Islamic scripture, Muslim law, and tradition makes Christians, and before that, Jews, before they were driven out of the Middle East, the low-cost, no-cost targets of violence in Muslim-majority countries throughout the world. Many Muslims oppose these terrible acts of violence, but the sad fact is that Islamic sources provide ample warrant for the violence currently being perpetrated against Christians in Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, and the rest of the Middle East. Christians are paying for our education here in the West with their very lives. To fail to learn about this problem is to break faith with the other parts of the body of Christ. And we must not allow spiritual leprosy to overtake us on this issue. The ideology of Muslim supremacism is one of the driving forces, if not the driving force, behind the catastrophe that is unfolding before our eyes. And it is rooted in notions of supersessionism, that are directed towards Jews and Christians. And we, as Christians, we have to basically tread lightly because we have had supersessionist and hostile attitudes towards the Jewish people. We are not innocent on this score. But at the same time, the Quran and other Islamic sources say very specific things about how Christians are supposed to be treated, and Jews as well. And so this is something that we have to pay very close attention to. And so anytime anybody says, well, you really have to tread lightly on this, these sources talk about us. Okay? Hopefully, we can work, that the Muslim community can adopt more humane interpretations of their sources so as to be able to live in peace with people from other religions, but we have a long ways to go. That's a reality that we have to deal with. But it's very important to speak as graciously and as ironically as possible about these things. And I will have to tell you that there are times when I have failed. And I am working harder on this. And one of the things is that I think that Pastor Lentz is one of the models. Okay, if you have a choice between, you know, doing what I say and doing what he does, do what he does. Okay? Yeah. Now, another thing is that we need to encourage Christians who lived in Muslim-majority countries to tell their stories. Frederick Douglass's Slave Narratives, his biography, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, awaken the world to the evils of slavery. And we need to hear similar stories like this from Christians from the Middle East and in other Muslim-majority environments. And that work is being done. And we need to give those people platforms. And one of the things that I hope going forward is that Hope Church actually provides a platform for some of these Christians to speak. And in particular, and there was one of the other Presbyterian denominations allowed a woman by the name of Juliana Taimarazi, I'm not sure which one it was, but spoke at their event in Detroit. Okay, and so you need to hear their stories and you need to help them tell their stories. And you can do it because the evangelical community here in the United States is basically one of the driving forces of American civil society today. Okay? The mainline community, to my terrible regret, has kind of collapsed and fallen down on the job, and the mantle has gone to you. Okay? And it's a burden, and it's one that I feel bad passing on to you, but it's what you've got. We also need to encourage reform-minded Muslims who are also targets of this attitude of supremacism to confront the misdeeds of groups like ISIS in a much more vocal way than they have been. And I don't want to diminish the work that's already been done, but we have a long ways to go. We need to encourage Muslims to take ownership of the problem, and in particular, we need to help them confront the issue of supersessionism. And this will require some very courageous leadership on the part of Christians. Interfaith dialogue that does not confront these very difficult issues is not worthy of the name. It is simply not dialogue. If we engage in interfaith dialogue with Muslim leaders and we don't speak vociferously about our co-religionists who are being murdered and other people who are being murdered and say, look, you know, you have an obligation to confront this. Just the same way that Northern whites living in the United States had an obligation to bring an end to the terrible civil rights abuses that took place in the United States prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Okay? Not everyone in the United States was responsible for the lynchings that took place against the African American community, okay, during the first half of the 20th century. Okay, but the fact is that we all had an obligation to bring those lynchings to an end. The same logic applies, I think, to the Muslim world, and that's a very important thing that we have to struggle with. It's difficult to say these things. It takes a lot of courage, but people who speak honestly, because people who speak honestly about things can be accused of Islamophobia or promoting a clash of civilizations. And it's also possible that somebody might end up targeted with a fatwa. The thing is that if you offend Jewish sensibilities, you might get a letter from the ADL, okay? You might get a letter from CAMRA, okay? I might write you a letter, okay? But the thing is that if you offend Islamic sensibilities, there's a very good chance that somebody is going to call for your murder. Just ask Salman Rushdie. And so I think as we close, and I'm going to bring it to an end, I want to tell you briefly a story about a Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, and I don't want to go on for too much longer. But what are our responsibilities? I'll show you. when I was leaving, I was at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference in March. And and the thing is I've been to 3 of them, 2012, 2014, 2016. The environment in Bethlehem has gotten progressively worse, and I was frightened this time in ways that I hadn't been frightened before. On Friday morning, when I was able to get out of there, I got into a taxi, and the taxi driver had Muslim prayer beads hanging from his rearview mirror. So I basically knew enough to kind of keep my mouth shut, frankly. Because I didn't really want to get into an argument about him. I just, here I was a Christian visiting Bethlehem, and I wanted to get to the checkpoint to get into Israel. And so we started talking, and he said, "So why are you here?" Oh, well, and I told him, I'm not, I may be a junkyard dog, but I ain't no dummy. I said, well, I'm here for a peace conference, okay? And he said, well, do you think there's going to be peace? And I hemmed and hawed, and I gave him some sort of answer. And he says, well, as a Christian, I don't think there's going to be peace. And I said, but the thing is you got Muslim prayer beads in your rearview mirror. He looked at me and he laughed. He said, I want to work. He says, if I hung a cross from my rearview mirror, 99% of the people in this town would not get in my taxi. And so there was a sigh of relief. I was like, oh, okay. So I talked a little bit more openly about it, but then I got out of the taxi. I gave him a tip. I was so glad to see him. And then I went through the checkpoint, which frankly is kind of a depressing place to go. It's not a pleasant thing to go through an Israeli checkpoint. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I pray for the people who work at those checkpoints, because I know that those checkpoints, catch people with knives and weapons that people might use to stab Israelis. And this was not at the height, but it was, well, while I was there, an American got stabbed in Jerusalem while I was in Bethlehem. And so it was kind of disconcerting. So I get through the checkpoint, and I'm on the Jerusalem side of the checkpoint, and I'm so relieved that I'm a Roman Catholic. I take out my prayer beads, and I start saying the rosary with a prayer. I was just so glad. I was sitting on like a concrete wall. Well, what happened was that there was somebody on the other side who was, you can tell it's important to be able to discern. I kind of made this person or marked this person to be a Muslim, and he wasn't happy to see me with my Christian prayer beads and my prayer book, in my rosary prayer book. The one that says "Hail Mary, full of grace." I know that's a scandal to you. I'm sorry. Okay. But it's a scandal to you, okay? But I could probably sit over there and pray the Hail Mary and nobody's going to bother me. Nobody's going to even look at me crooked. This guy looked at me crooked. He did not like me, and it was pretty disconcerting. But the thing was, I knew at that point that it was an irresponsible thing. I could have just said, I memorized Psalm 130. I should have just sat there and done that. And I should have prayed in private, in my secret room, like the New Testament says, but I didn't, okay? But once I pulled the prayer beads out and started praying, I wasn't going to put them back, because I didn't want, it was like, I'm showing the colors, okay? I'm not putting them away. As I was doing it, I continued to get this ugly vibe. Another guy came over to me, and he was in his, maybe late 50s, early 60s, and what happened was that he had a kind countenance on me. He basically had a loving and kind countenance on his face. And what happened was that he stood next to me. And I was like, that's funny. So then what happened was that during the course of while I was praying my rosary, and there's 5 decades of 10 prayer, but anyhow, and I got them all wrong because I was so frightened. Okay? I got them all wrong. At a certain point, he basically pulled up his sleeve. And he showed that he had a tattoo of the Sacred Heart of Jesus with a chain going up to a cross on his forearm. And then he pulled up the cross from around his neck, and he showed it to me. And I was like, oh, I can finish my prayer. And then he kind of looked over, he pointed to the other guy, and he said, he's a Muslim. And I gathered that. And what happened was he kind of gestured. He said, he might actually, and we couldn't even really, he could speak a little bit of English. I speak no Arabic, and I apologize for that, but I can't, I'm 51, okay? So anyhow, he said, and I said, you really think so? And he said, yeah, you never know. And what happened was that I finished my prayers, and I put them back in the thing. I gave him, I gave him my prayer beads in the pocket that I put them in, and I gave him a copy of my business card. That guy showed the solidarity to me that we need to show to them. So thanks very much.
Wow, that was powerful, Dexter and Trisha. We can't really have a conference like this without it getting heavy at times, and that's just part of this. So I want to end by quoting Jesus, a Jewish theologian, recorded in Greek, and then translated into English. One of my favorite things that Jesus says, and for those who were at Hope 2 Sundays ago when I preached on this text, it's when Jesus says tharse, sometimes tharseta, which means take heart, be of good cheer. So in the midst of this, let's take heart that there are people who come alongside those who are in need, just as Dexter has shown us. Let's be of good cheer as we continue to learn together. That's the purpose of this conference. Tomorrow morning we start at 9 o'clock. For those who can be here, you can see it's going to be a rich experience. Some of you can't be here, but you're going to join us again tomorrow night. We'll start at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. We're going to close tonight. Dr. Brad Long, I said, I knew I was going to do that. I have a friend, Dr. Brad Long. This is Dr. Brad Young. He's going to come and give us a blessing from Numbers chapter 6.
Thank you, Pastor. Hasn't this been a great blessing tonight? We enjoyed Joanne's tell us about your family and Dexter, Trisha, Dr. This has just been great. This is the blessing that we call the Aaronic blessing. Would you just stand and bow your heads, and may this be a prayer. The pastor has asked me to share it with you in Hebrew, the language that it was given. V'yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, v'ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha, yisa Adonai panav elecha, v'yasem lecha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his presence, his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and grant to you peace. Amen.